Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. I had promised some folks in a traveler group on Facebook, of which I am a member, that I would do an episode before the end of the year, which means right now, because the year is almost over, and this has to drop on Wednesday, the 1st of January. And I would do it about a new traveler adventure that was recently released and that I have almost finished running. Now, normally we end off the year with a year in review and a forecast and hopes for our gaming. As Chris and I are gaming looking forward into the next calendar year. And again, because of scheduling, holiday scheduling definitely gets in the way of things. We have yet to record that episode. Hopefully we'll get that done in the next week or so, and then we'll put that up. So in place of that is my overview, review, and commentary on Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition's Opening Moves, 5th Frontier War adventure. So what I'm going to do is break this into three pieces, three parts, and go through in sequence. If you're a player, or you intend to be, you hope to be a player, I would stop listening after the first segment. In the first segment, I'll do an overview, summary of the adventure. In the second segment, I am going to talk through the story elements in the story in a little more depth. Not so much from a spoiler standpoint, but just for GMs to give them an idea as to whether or not this is something they might want to run. And finally, I will give my review, and I'll add some commentary based on my run of it. So first off, this adventure, I own the PDF of. I got it from DriveThru. The PDF is 162 pages, and it is a combination of adventure content and background material, including ships, systems, like star systems, and NPCs and equipment that are relevant for the story. About half the book, half of the PDF by page count is the adventure, and the other half is divided into, like I said, those different portions. So Opening Moves is meant to be an adventure wherein the player characters have the war kind of dumped on them, or it erupts around them. And to their surprise and probably chagrin, interrupting whatever else they're up to. That's how I ran it, and that is basically how it's presented. There isn't really much about, there are some suggestions. There is no set reason as to why the party should be at the star system where they are in the Spinward Marches when the war erupts around them. That's left to the GM. What does happen, though, is once the war gets going, or once they're faced with it, is that they have to escape the immediate surroundings where they find themselves, and then because they get linked up with an NPC that's basically a MacGuffin, they have to make their way across District 268, which is one of the subsectors of the Spinward Marches sector, and then meet up with a noble that is that character's, that NPC's patron. This adventure enables you to introduce the 5th Frontier War and do so in a way that gets the characters immediately involved and then leaves them, that is, it ends at something of a crossroads where you, the GM, can decide, obviously along with your players, what's going to happen next. Are they going to be more involved with the war? Are they going to get involved with this noble? It actually ends off in a good way that could lead to more adventures of any sort. So there's a basic overview of it. Opening Moves, which has multiple meanings. It's the opening moves of the Zodani as they attack the Third Imperium. And it's also then obviously the opening moves, the immediate response by the people in that system and the player characters as to what do they do, again, when a war erupts right around them, completely unawares. So if that sounds interesting, you as a GM, let's go ahead and continue into the book in more depth. Players, if that sounds interesting to you, hound your GM to run it. Okay, so moving forward, what's in the book? It's a 162-page PDF, and as I said before, about 80 pages. A little over 80 pages is the adventure content itself. It starts off with about 30 some odd pages of background to the launch of the war by the Zodani in this area of space. and then also system content and information like maps of planets and things like that. So it does a really nice job of establishing from the jump like if you're not familiar as a GM with Iterati, which is in the Five Sisters subsector, if you're not familiar with it, well, this will get you familiar with it. And not only will it do that, but it'll get you familiar with it in a way that presents you with a lot of actionable story content, like how does Iterati High Port function? And there are maps and there's information about the security patrols and things like that. It's like many Mongoose books, it's fluff heavy in that the authors seek to tell you a story about a series of events and tell you a story about a place and the things that go on there. And then leaving you, the GM, to extract or synthesize out of that content the specific things that the characters see and are able to do and how the world around them reacts. So about 30 some pages starts off with all that, and then it goes into the adventure itself. And it starts off, as I said, in Iterati's High Port, and the assumption is that the player characters are there for some reason or another. And as things suddenly start to get a little strange and go sideways, that is, news reports, news feeds pop up about some kind of protests and then violence going on the planet. And then there are some other tells within the High Port that things are not normal right now. The player characters get to recognize that a security situation is going on. And then the shooting starts. And in this shooting, as they try to get out of harm's way, they encounter the MacGuffin. They encounter this non-player character, Zivinkin, the tennis star, whose patron, they will find out later, is this noble who has him as something of an information courier moving around, trying to gather support for his way of viewing, what he sees as an impending war, which actually happens to come true. It then becomes the party's responsibility to help this individual get off the station. He has a ship if they don't, and get all the way across District 268 to meet up with the noble, this Viscount that is his patron. Now, there is something here. I mean, it is a bit on a plot side. It is a bit of I wouldn't say a railroad, but I mean, the plot clearly points toward the party is going to encounter this person while all this, explosions and all this violence and this attack is taking place, and that they will then seek to help him, and that this will then lead to this string of adventures that follow in the rest of the book. I'll circle back to that at the end. There's an interesting portion of the book on the station that depicts all the challenges that the party will face getting off this station while there are terrorist attacks going on the station, and then the Zodani fleet out in space launching missiles at the station. So that's an interesting interlude where the party has multiple different ways to get off the station. There's an assumption that they will take a certain route. There's a lot of detail provided for that. But eventually they get off the station. And then I'd say the middle section of the adventure, if that's the beginning of the adventure, the middle section of it is their journey across District 268. And there are profiles of specific systems in that subsector of what is going on there, how, as news travels slowly in the traveler universe, as news reaches these stations about this attack, what's the response? So the travelers have an opportunity to move through these systems and interact with the people there in each of those places and the goings on there in ways that, obviously can vary based on player decision, but I think reflect, at least from my standpoint, a plausible or realistic set of affairs as they make their way away from this invasion. The third and final portion, or call it, in this arc, the third portion of the adventure takes place in the Elixabeth system, which is in District 268, but pretty close to Imperial space, and has them being taken aboard an Imperial naval ship, a big cruiser, where they go through an inquiry. They're questioned, not interrogated, no rubber hoses, but they're questioned because their ship transponder tells the Navy that, hey, we just came from this place, and the Navy knows there's a war going on there. And then finally, they meet this Viscount. They're there with Zivinkin, the tennis star slash secret courier, and then they get mixed up in some other things uh, with the Zodani continuing their attack, and they have an opportunity to escape again, be heroes, and potentially get wrapped up with this Viscount and his perspective again, as I said, on the war. So again, the adventure consists of three main acts. The first act takes place on Iterati Highport and involves primarily, depending on how much setup you want to do, action scenes of them dealing with the attack and then escaping the system with their MacGuffin. The middle section is movement through multiple systems in District 268 of the Spinward Marches, and there's plenty of information in the book, whatever route they take. But if they have a jump to ship, they're going to end up at least some of the systems that are well described, and especially with the events going on in those systems. And then the third act takes place in the Elizabeth system, and that's where they get connected with this Viscount. They're on this Imperial naval ship, and then more action, adventure, and explosions take place, and they have an opportunity to escape, be heroes, make a name for themselves, and that's where the adventure wraps up. So now on to review and commentary. I've been running this now for a number of sessions, about 2 months or so, I think, something like that. I run a weekly game, and it's going really well. I'm running it for a group of players who, previous to this run of Traveler, that is, had never played Traveler before, ever. They had always heard of this game where you could die during character creation. We all know, unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. But they'd never played it before. And so it's been cool to run them through a couple of adventures. I saw the Fifth Frontier War book, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. I really want to drop a war on a party of characters. But I didn't want to just do it right out of the gate. So I ran several adventures, like Spinward Marches adventures, High and Dry, a classic, and then two others, one of my own creation and one, I forget what it was called, but it had to do with going with some rich patron to a planet on a safari looking for some animal who had never been found before. So I ran some introductory adventures to get them into the system, the game system that is, into their characters, and start to understand the Traveler universe, the norms of it, and like what's the Imperium and how to jump drives, all that kind of stuff. Acclimating them to it because I wanted them to have that information before I blew everything up with a Fifth Frontier War. By the time we got to this, they are experienced and they are proficient players and becoming more knowledgeable in the universe. That said, it was really easy with all the background information at the beginning about the Iterati Highport and all the ebb and flow of how the station functions. Reading all that really put me in a position where I could plot out what kinds of things are you up to? What kinds of things are you doing on this station? And then when we slowed down the narrative to the day that everything went sideways, I felt really confident in my extemporaneous, my reactions. Because I had a general sketch of how I wanted things to go, but obviously I don't know what they're going to do. But I had a sense of this is how the station functions as a site and as an organization and people. So that was really good. The escape from the Highport was good. They did take the bait, and they as I threw little clues at them, and they decided to try to get to this hangar. The adventure assumes that the party is going to jump in vac suits, go outside, and go on the outside of the Highport to get to to one of the hangar bays. I threw enough clues at them, and they decided that was a good idea. And so then I was able to follow the sequence of things and the ideas of how do you handle that and the challenges you would face on the outside of this thing as missiles are being lobbed at this giant Highport. That was really cool. And it had a good level of kind of plausible, kind of crunchy, gritty Traveler adventure. It wasn't like Star Trek or Star Wars. It didn't feel like that. It felt right for Traveler. Anyway, so everything in the adventure up to that point, I was like, okay, this is cool. This is great. It works. They get on their ship, the ship that the MacGuffin character, Zivinkin, the tennis player, had access to, but he hadn't linked up with the crew that had been rented for him yet. So, hey, great, we have a crew for you. So everything up to this point had run really well. They escape, and then we move to this middle section, and they moved through a couple of the star systems. They moved through three of them that were specifically defined and described in the book itself: Asseltine, um, Bowman, and then Walston. Walston didn't get a whole lot of attention, but in a previous adventure, they had been to Walston. That's where High and Dry takes place. So that was a kind of a no-brainer where they would stop. At Asseltine, that was the first stop. They show up. News is already there about the war, and fuel prices I quintupled because that's what happens. And this is where this was the first hitch that I experienced in running the adventure. So as they're there, and the main challenge is you're there, there's a bunch of ships there, there are refugees there, and everything is just gone through the roof in prices because it's a war. And then a big Zodani ship shows up and demands everyone stand down and surrender. So they got out of there. They were fueled up enough that they left. I was like, okay, that's cool. And then they get to Bowman, and Bowman posits this whole situation where there are belters and there are like mining corporation folks who don't really get along. But now that they've found out about this war, they're putting aside their differences and they are evacuating the big state. Anyway, they're working together to try to protect their families and the non-combatants and themselves. And so it gave the player characters an opportunity to like share information about what they'd seen and experienced. And then a huge Sword Worlds ship, like a massive armed merchant, shows up. And again, this is all in the book. Shows up and is going to attack the station. So that's two stops with two massive enemy ships showing up to attack. I was like, okay, that's a little redundant. It makes sense, like as a story and the whole idea of like the way the Zodani attacked and why and this whole 9 yards. But I was like, okay, Then they do what they do there, and then they move on to, they stop off at Walston, and they get enough fuel. Anyway, they move on. They make it to Elizabeth. This was the most, from the reading, for me, this was what I expected to be the most challenging scene, because it exists in three pieces. There's this naval inquiry. So the Navy says, hey, we're going to board your ship and you're going to come on board and we're going to question you because you just came from a war zone and we need to gather information from you. Totally makes sense. It was challenging because the inquiry is conducted by 4 NPCs. So I hate that as GM when you're like, well, let's see, I'm going to change my voice 4 times, and I've got to get inside each of these 4 NPCs so that they react to my player responses in a way that's plausible and varied. That was challenging. What I ended up doing is having one of the officers actually conduct the interview and the other ones just periodically interjected. It's like that, I think made more sense. The second, call it scene, more narrative in nature for this last act, involves a whole bunch of politicking and rubbing elbows with nobles and the nobles' hangers-on. And the final scene, which I haven't gotten to yet, is when a Zodani fleet shows up and attacks the Imperial Navy there and more than likely whoops their butt, which then gives the characters the opportunity to escape with the wounded Viscount, thus gaining a patron. And this is where I stepped back and I was like, it's a little redundant. So you have an attack, you get an NPC you need to rescue, and you've got a bolt because overwhelming force is in your face. You go to another place, overwhelming force shows up, you have to run. Then you go to another place and overwhelming force shows up, and more than likely you have to run. And then you get to the final act, and the final act ends with overwhelming force, and you have to run. Now, all that said, my players haven't groused at all about this. They've been enjoying themselves. And I do think that given the way the war is set up in the Fifth Frontier War book, which you actually don't need to have to run this adventure because there is enough content introducing everything on the front end, it makes sense. It actually makes sense story-wise, and I think that fits Traveler, like the vibe. Let's just not throw in scenes and interludes and whatnot because we want to vary the plot. Let's make it actually be plausible. So even though it is redundant, it makes sense, and the players have enjoyed it so far. Now some commentary and some suggestions as to how you might go about running this thing and doing so smoothly. I do not recommend starting it just, hey, we have a new group of travelers and boom, you guys are iterati for some reason or another, and you happen to run into this guy Zivinkin while people are shooting at him, and you happen to decide when all this crap is flying around you that you're going to help this guy out. That to me seemed like a stretch. So knowing I wanted to run this, I had the characters rather. My players were in my garage. They actually weren't on a spaceship. What I did with these adventures like High and Dry and this safari adventure and the other one that I made up myself is I had them moving around District 268 on different jobs. And the last job, they were hired as like a security crew for like a corporate tech team. Company was moving some technicians with some precision machine parts, never described or defined what that actually was, didn't need to, all the way to Iterati. And it was going to take a couple of weeks. And so they were hired as the security element just to watch this. And I did this for two reasons. The first reason was I wanted them to remember that in Traveler, not everything happens because you're the player characters. Not everything happens, not every action that's happening around you is happening because of you. So I had some bounty hunters stop the ship in the middle of nowhere while it was trying to refuel. And they, of course, were convinced the bounty hunters were after the tech crew and whatever precision machine parts they had. But actually, it was after a rich heiress who had stowed away with some like Eurotrash friends and dad's credit card. So they learned something about the Traveler universe there. But in dealing with that on this liner, they met Zivinkin. They met this the MacGuffin character that is so central to getting the characters into the opening move story. I had them meet him on his way to Iterati, where he was going to do some tennis exhibitions, which sounds absurd, but the description in the book as to why really actually makes sense, and it's kind of a neat idea. So they met him beforehand, befriended him on this long voyage to Iterati, several weeks, so that when he was doing his exhibitions and when he was doing stuff on the station and they were there for several days spending money and hanging out, they kept bumping into him or would go see his exhibitions, so that when the poop hit the fan and bullets started flying and then they ran into him and he was injured, there was already this like, okay, we got to help this guy out. He's our dude. So there's one thing I suggest. Find a way to connect them in some way, shape, or form with whatever that party is doing before everything blows up. Find a way to connect him to this Zivinkin character casually, not as like what he really is. The other thing that I recommend, I already mentioned it, with the interrogation, the inquiry, whatever you want to call it, just pick one of the characters as the main talker and then have the other ones maybe interject one question each. That way you really don't have to come up with the mood, the vibe, the accent, the posture, the whatever for four different characters and have to keep it straight in your head as you attempt to basically have a conversation with yourself and then your players periodically. Finally, the outro is very much like the intro. And to be honest, I haven't gotten to that yet. That is what we are getting to in our last two sessions. I think it's probably going to take about 2 sessions to do it. My plan is to set up the player or the characters in a position where they will get to make up their mind after they escape. I mean, if they don't escape, they die. Assuming they escape and they save the Viscount, if it makes sense that that's what happens, obviously then they're in a position where he could potentially become their patron and send them on, missions about, to help out his view of the war, whatever. But my goal with that is to be as open-ended with it as possible, to leave them with the option to do what they want, and then we'll take the party where we feel like. Anyway, so overall, it's a really good adventure. It's a really well-written book. There are maps. There are, there's deployment information about the Zodani fleet. The the write-up of the attack on Iterati, the combination of like terror attacks being done by Zodani, like dupes, basically. I'm not going to spoil it. You got to go find this out yourself. I think was really well written, and it was really easy to execute. It made sense. It felt like something you would like see in the news headlines. And then after they got out of Iterati and made their way across District 268 and all the way to Elixabeth, all those moments, those scenes in those different systems, even though I do think they're a touch redundant, they worked and they made sense. One last thing. It might sound like there's a lot of space combat in this. And there is, however, the book explicitly says again and again to handle it narratively and actually provides some like, call it like an ad hoc subsystem for determining like what the characters do and how successful they are. How does that move the needle on the battle overall? Because there's no expectation whatsoever. In fact, there's an admonition to not try to play this out using the Starship Combat rules as written. Everyone's in it would be a mess. You'd be at the table forever. Story-wise, that middle section is, like I said, redundant. And mechanically, it's also a tad redundant. But it worked, and the players enjoyed it. And I was able to, again, use those moments, those scenes in those different systems to not only give them a story and have them work on it, but also introduce ideas that I see as like central to or germane to the Traveler universe, and get them, continually learning more about this whole funky universe in which they're operating as player characters. So anyway, I will put a link to the drive-through page from Mongoose's drive-through presence so that you can take a look at it. If you're interested in the Fifth Frontier War, or running an adventure that's set in it, this is a great way to jump into it, especially in a place it's like a secondary front. It's not the main place where the whole war is starting to happen. And as always, the content, the background content, the fluff, as I call it, is quality. It's well written, it's interesting, and it gives you enough that you can, as I said, react plausibly as places, as characters, as situations, as all those things evolve. So there you go. Opening moves, Traveler, Mongoose 2nd edition. Good stuff. Thank you for listening, and Happy New Year. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.